Good morning. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray. Today is Popcast 82, and it's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 32. So, again, where we left off was how are we to relate to people whose fear has grown into hate or whose intellect has grown to arrogance? And we talked about, the case of violence yesterday, and I'll let that wait and consider such matters as prison and prison reform as a part of a bunch of social arrangement issues that we'll take up later. For today, in other cases, I want to start with reading a quote from a book called Hatred, The Psychological Descent into Violence by Willard Gaylin, Gaylin, MD. And the book was written in recent years. I'm always slow on the uptake. 2003. And he has some statements on page 219. I'm sorry. I'm kind of disorganized here today. I thought I had this right at my fingertips. On page 199, he has some statements that are relevant to what we're discussing here. I don't entirely agree with all of his statements, and I'll explain, more so why. But it's a starting point, and I think it's a starting point that it has a lot of merit to it and is well worth, reading. So he says. Some profound differences in moral values among different cultures are justifiably a matter of opinion and open to debate. And he says abortion, therapeutic clonings, arranged marriage, capital punishment, paternalism are examples of that. Decent people can disagree on many important issues without conceding the ethical ground. But, and this is the important part, there are not two sides to every question. With many questions, there is only one morally acceptable opinion. There are values that transcend cultural directives and that must always be honored. And as an example, he says, slavery is always wrong. Racial and religious persecution, child abuse, the subjugation of women, torture, gratuitous cruelty to people or animals, rape, and pederasty, to list but some, are never justifiable. Where a culture espouses these values, we would be perfectly free, morally obligated, he would say, to condemn it as a pathological or evil culture. He says that we consider actions to be a product of an autonomous individual, even while acknowledging the power exerted by the culture on that individual during his formative years. We may be sympathetic to the individual while still loathing his behavior. We do not have to subscribe to moral relativism. We can insist that there are universal goods and evils that transcend cultural differences. So, the question is, how are we to relate to people whose fear has grown into hate or whose intellect has grown to arrogance? And it is part of what's going on in the Great Divide. uh, and it necessarily involves religion and intellectualism. And as such, these are hot ticket items. Um, I'm going to give as my personal point of view that the way we relate to these people is to disagree with them, that we don't hold the same point of view, but at the same time, look for possible first step overtures that you could make towards them as people, so that you want to make it plain to them that you would very much like to view them as people, and to have them view you as people, as be part of the us and not the them, and treat each other with the attitude that's included in both being us. There's always disagreements within us. Heavens, in every family, there's strong differences of opinion about a whole range of things, but you're still us. So we're not looking to end the disagreements. We're looking to end the separation, the sense that each side of the Great Divide has, that the other side is not us, that they're them. So that involves something about, well, is there any aspect of the Great Divide that includes such moral outrage that it can't be accepted? And of course, everybody on both sides of the Great Divide has very strong feelings that have arisen to the level of hate, as you can see in all of the media today, and including the social media that we create ourselves, where we're very much mimicking these very strong feelings. So this book is going to have some stuff to say about hate as a psychiatric subject. He is a psychiatrist. And the book was, it's highly regarded. The New York Times called it wise and very disturbing, because he says things about us that it's based on his experience as a psychiatrist and his understanding of ourselves as a species, that are pretty tough to hear, including such things as he finds love one another to be beyond unrealistic, and he just pays little or no attention to it. He feels that the Old Testament 10 Commandments are a lot more reasonable for psychiatric reasons of our ability to see people as us and them. And he says that we'll never have 100% us and 0% them. He said it's just not possible. And so he has a lot of things to say that are worth talking about. We'll talk about this book for a couple of days at least. But for today, I just wanted to bring him up. And I, am influenced by everything he has to say. I'm respectful of everything he has to say because of his credentials. But I'm more inclined to support some of the things he says than others, and we'll take those apart. For me, the key response is, as I've said in bygone podcasts, I do agree that there's individual responsibility, and I also agree that it's very much influenced by our culture and upbringing. But it seems to me that our psychology is calling for us, above all, to see the gift of each other, and that includes, the notion of us versus them, which is also a gift of our psychology, but of our older psychology, which our cultural psychology is busily replacing. And so while we acknowledge us versus them as a reality that makes hate easier and more possible, we also acknowledge that the cultural growth of the concept of the gift of each other can help alleviate the effects of hate, and to the extent that they contribute to the Great Divide as a cause or as merely an effect. In either case, uh, our appreciation of the cultural strength, growing cultural strength of the gift of each other can help. And the key to that is we have to be open. We have to look for opportunities to make a first step. That's how we recreate the middle. And we make a distinction between things we don't agree with and things that, and the person whom we would very much like to be in part of the gift of each other with. We want to be us with. And that's, in general, my take on how we relate to people. And we may find ourselves, most everybody who's, you know, alive today in the United States is part of the Great Divide. And there's a good deal of anger. And in some people, it rises to something that looks like hate. So, clearly, we're going to say we condemn hate, even though it's an understandable thing that happens in the lives of some people. There is apparently enough capacity to turn away from hate and turn towards each other that we can reasonably say to others, your behavior is hateful and you can stop being that way. And I'm reaching out towards you in the hope that you will stop being that way. So that's a pretty general statement. We have to find a lot more particulars for how we might pull that off. But it's almost anybody's guess as to what in the particular moment that you're confronted with tomorrow with somebody from the other side of the Great Divide, is going to turn out to be an opening step that you could make towards the other, so that you might see each other as us and not them. So one of the things I think we're going to find useful in due time is rituals and symbols in general. Just as hate mongers use rituals and symbols to manipulate us negatively, art and culture and particularly the whole world of the sacred has always used rituals and symbols in a very positive way for the most part. And so the question would be, what rituals and symbols that have power in our hearts can we use in furtherance of promoting the gift of each other? And typically, all religious symbols in encouraging some version of the golden rule should be helpful. There may be a problem with some symbols having been too closely identified with one side or the other of the Great Divide. But it's possible we could rescue symbols from service of the Great Divide to service of ending the Great Divide or lessening it. So we have to learn a lot more about rituals and symbols, which ends, in general terms. So I'll be doing some reading on those subjects, the use of rituals and symbols in furtherance of lessening the Great Divide, and I'll put some ideas out for conversation's sake. One thing I think we can say is it's pretty difficult to know what is wise in a particular moment in dealing with somebody, who on Facebook who just posted something which is deeply outrageous to you, and something from the other side of the Great Divide, or who has just posted outrage over something that somebody from the other side of the Great Divide has said or done this morning. And it's difficult to say what's wise for you to do at that moment. And it's very difficult to live wisely in the face of hate. And there seems to be a fair amount of hate flowing both ways in the Great Divide. And what about all those souls that don't seem to be hate-filled but are just angry? Um, the possibilities should be a little larger, because we can also learn some devices for asking people to temporarily set aside their anger and consider you as somebody that they may want to include more in us, and keep less in them. Uh, so anger is difficult, but less difficult than hate. What Gaylin says, by the way, about hate is that it starts with what he calls displacement. There's something going on inside you that you really don't like, and you decide to find an enemy and put it on the enemy. And we talked in recent days about projection and shadow material. And this is a related concept. He's a psychiatrist and not a psychologist. I don't know what he thinks about Jung. Um, I don't know, in all honesty. I know very little about psychiatry. Of course, I know very little about a lot of things, but more so than a lot of subjects, I know very little about psychiatry, more about psychology, and even then, just scratching the surface of Jungian psychology, and a little tiny bit beyond that. So I confess that this whole, it uses a lot of terms I've never heard of. Let me see. One of them is, oh goodness, I'm not going to open the book and start looking for his stuff. Today we'll consider those books in a few days, but suffice it to say, there's a lot in here I didn't know anything about until I started reading this book. And so now there seems to be something going on here in this great divide that I would like to talk about, and I'm going to venture it. It's a maybe. I'm not saying this is the case, but I'm going to venture this maybe. It's possible that there is an appreciation of confidence in one's own ability more so on one side of the divide as compared to, on the other side of the divide, a confidence in God and in your relationship to God. So, if there's anything to that, it's not so much of, oh, look what you've done wrong or where you've gone wrong, but you can appreciate that both of these things could honestly occur and be perfectly acceptable psychological, emotional stance, part of the defining point of view of an individual, the way you've come to terms with the world, perhaps from your upbringing, perhaps from your own individual experiences, but certainly because of the Great Divide is so established in cultures, in subcultures around the country. Your cultural influence is going to have a big part in this. But it is typical that people who are marked more by intellect than by religious faith as the thing that seems to be how they proceed in dealing with the world have something to do with the Great Divide. Not that there aren't intelligent people on both sides or believers on both sides, but that some of the dismay about the other may be connected to this difference, that there are these people who take confidence more from their own abilities and those people who take confidence more from their relation to God. Now, there's nothing wrong with either of those, but you could easily see how it could be used as fodder for dislike and anger. It could arise, and then, in the case of some people, hate. And there are skillful manipulators out there who are trying to get us to increase our hate, in part because they make a living out of spewing hate. And, in all honesty, I don't know if all of these people who are making a living spewing hate could earn a living through any honest means. Maybe so, maybe not. But, there's plenty of people who are perfectly able to work, but who'd rather stick up, a grocery store, 7-Eleven, as the way to get, the money they need to live on. I mean, the computer hackers are brilliant, and they can certainly earn a very respectable living in the honest world, but they prefer not to. So, there's this. I offer it as a possibility. It's occurred to me that it may have some part to play in things, and the point would be that if we began to see that as having some role in the divide, we could see that we could more easily back off from our intense dislike and lessen the level of dramatic anger, at least, if not hatred, towards the other side of the Great Divide, because you could see that, you could appreciate that, both are very understandable reactions. They depend in part on your upbringing. They depend in part on your individual circumstances. But there are certainly people that go through life basically relying on their relation to God, and there seem to be people that go through life basically relying on their own abilities. And they seem to be connected to the Great Divide. Okay, so went on too much about that. I wanted to use a biblical reference. I've had this in my notes for weeks, and I haven't gotten around to it until this moment. There is, as I've said a number of times, a lot of wisdom in the Bible. I'm especially fond of the parables in that sense, that there's just so much to, distilled wisdom in the parables. Okie doke. So, sorry, help me here. Luke 15. Okay, my old eyes are having a problem. The print's pretty small. Okay, so a man had two sons. This is Luke 15, 11 to 31. And it's the parable of the prodigal. So a man had two sons. When the younger told his father, "I want my share of your estate now, instead of waiting until you die," his father agreed to divide his wealth equally between the sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and took a trip to a distant land, and there wasted all his money on parties and prostitutes. About the time his money was gone, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded the local farmer to hire him to feed his pigs. The boy became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the swine looked good to him, and no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, "At home, even the hired men have food enough and to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired man.' So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long distance away, his father saw him coming and was filled with loving pity and ran and embraced him and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and you, and am not worthy of being called your son.' But the father said to the slaves, 'Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him, and a jeweled ring for his finger, and shoes, and kill the calf we have in the fattening pen. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead and has returned to life. He was lost and is found.' So the party began. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working when he returned home. He heard dance music coming from the house, and he asked some of the servants what was going on. 'Your brother is back,' he was told, 'and your father has killed the calf we were fattening and has prepared a great feast to celebrate his coming home again unharmed.' The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, 'All these years I have worked hard for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And in all that time, you never gave me even a young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after spending your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the finest calf we have on the place.' 'Look, dear son,' the father said to him, 'you and I are very close, and everything I have is yours. But it is right to celebrate, for he is your brother, and he was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' Now, I got to tell you, so this says, by comparison, something about how we need to relate to people, even those whose fear has grown to hate and whose intellect has grown to arrogance. We treat them as people who are acting like the prodigal. They're lost, and we hope that they can find themselves, and we extend, the first step of hopeful possibilities towards them. There are some more quotes and more comments, but enough for today. There's always tomorrow. Well, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? There isn't always tomorrow, as we well know. But while we don't presume on tomorrow, we do largely plan on it. So whatever is left unsaid at this moment, we're going to leave it that way. See you tomorrow. Take care.